Hi everyone, this week we will be covering Chapter 2, talking about prenatal development and the newborn period. We will be covering prenatal development, hazards to prenatal development, the birth experience, and the newborn infant. Just as a reminder, I will be using gender-neutral language as we go along, unless it pertains to a study done in a specific population. If you have questions about this, you can refer to my welcome slides in week 1 or contact me if you have any further questions. Also know that this lecture touches on miscarriage and infant mortality, as well as structural racism. I know these are difficult topics to talk about, but it is important to this chapter, so just be aware as you go through. When talking about prenatal development, the moment life begins is considered to be a cultural construct. It is a concept created by society. Life doesn't have one definition, and it will vary based on both the culture and the individual. In Western society, science and philosophy suggest around 100 definitions of life. And in the US, there is a lot of debate whether life begins at conception or whether it begins when the individual takes their first breath. Your book suggests that this is a bit ironic, given that these debates often fail to recognize how complex this topic is, or the degree to which other cultures have views on it. For example, in the Bang, a society living in West Africa, their idea of life is really abstract, with life beginning even before conception, believing that infants are reincarnations of their ancestors. Given that this class is focused on development, we are less concerned about when life starts and more concerned about how people become who they are, which includes how they form in the womb. Conception refers to the union of an egg and sperm resulting in fertilization. These egg, also called ovum, and sperm cells are called gametes. Gametes are reproductive cells that contain half of the genetic material of all other cells in the body. These cells contain only half of the genetic material needed because when they come together, they contain the full amount of genetic material. To get the cell containing only half of our genetic material, it must go through meiosis, a form of cell division where ovum and sperm only receive one chromosome from each of the 23 chromosome pairs. Chromosomes being an organized package of DNA found in the nucleus of the cell. This leaves gametes with 23 individual chromosomes. When gametes combine, they go from having 23 individual chromosomes to having 23 pairs of chromosomes. When gametes combine and the ovum is fertilized, it becomes a zygote with the full 23 pairs of chromosomes. There are 4 developmental processes that transform a zygote to an embryo to a fetus. The first being mitosis, which is cell division resulting in 2 identical daughter cells. On the last slide, we talked about meiosis, where cell division results in gametes with half the genetic material of all other cells. Mitosis, however, creates identical cells with the same genetic information. So meiosis has half the genetic material, and mitosis has the full amount. After mitosis creates these cells, they migrate, where they move away from the point of origin and go where they're needed in a process called cell differentiation, where they start to become specialized in a specific structure and function. These cells continue to multiply to build the fetus, but sometimes after they form, they are no longer needed and then go through apoptosis, which is genetically programmed cell death. We can see this with structures like the hand, where it starts out as kind of a flipper, and then certain cells die, which leave us with fingers. Looking at early development, we see the growth of a neural tube, which is a groove formed in the top layer of differentiated cells in the embryo that eventually becomes the brain and spinal cord. We also see the amniotic sac, which is a transparent fluid-filled membrane that surrounds and protects the fetus. When we talk about someone's water breaking in labor, it is the amniotic sac that is ruptured. Then there is the placenta, which is a support organ for the fetus that permits the exchange of materials carried in the bloodstream of the fetus and birth parents. This is how the fetus receives nutrients, and after the infant is born, the placenta is delivered separately, about 10 to 15 minutes after birth. Lastly, there is the umbilical cord, which is a tube connecting the fetus to the placenta. When we look at what it's like for fetuses and their behavior, we see that fetal movement begins around 5 to 6 weeks after conception, and as it continues, movement gets more sophisticated. We see the emergence of hiccups and swallowing, movement of limbs and fingers, and respiratory readiness for breathing independently after birth. For the most part, fetal movement helps them practice and prepare for the outside world. When we look at behavioral cycles, we do see that there are cycles of both rest and activity, although activity does decrease in the later half of the prenatal period. There is some sense of circadian rhythm, where the fetus at least somewhat knows the difference between day and nights. And then we also know that fetuses have rapid eye movement or REM cycles during sleep, which is the deepest stage of sleep. Generally, we say that REM sleep is associated with dreams, but we don't really have a solid way of studying that prenatally, so that part is not confirmed. Looking at the senses of fetuses in the womb, we do see that they have some sight, but it's minimal. Basically, if something is really bright, they should be able to detect it, but they're probably not getting a full range of colors or anything like that. And we do know that fetuses have preferences for what they look at, which is really cool. We also know that they have a sense of touch, where they can make contact with parts of the body, they can grasp the umbilical cord, rub their face, and even suck their thumb. With taste, we do see that they can detect flavors in the amniotic fluid, and with smell, they can detect odor from what the birth parent eats. Lastly, with hearing, we see that the fetus does respond to various sounds from at least 6 months of age. They also recognize voices, although we do see that they have a preference for their birth parent's voice. Fetuses can also learn. There are a lot of studies that show this, but the book really focuses on two basic aspects of learning. One is habituation, which is a simple form of learning where there's a decrease in response to a repeated or continued stimulus. Basically, you show someone something for so long, they stop responding to it. The example on the slide is kind of a fun one, with a child making noise for so long that the parent just gets used to it and can keep reading. In psychology research, our habituation tends to be more simple, especially with children. This would be more like showing an infant a picture of black and white lines until they stop looking at it or responding to it. Or looking at this prenatally, we might show a fetus a bright light or play a noise for an extended period of time until they habituate and their response decreases. And this tends to show up around 30 weeks gestation. There is also dishabituation, which is an introduction of a new stimulus that rekindles interest following habituation to a repeated stimulus. This is usually through taking the stimulus away and then showing it again later, which it brings back that interest. In the case of visual or auditory stimuli with a fetus, you would take away the light or stop playing the sound after they stop responding. You would wait a little while and then show it to them again and watch them start responding all over again. A major focus of this chapter is hazards during prenatal development. There are sensitive periods that we need to be worried about, where a certain type of development is most likely, although it may still happen later. To give an example, you might have heard that language has a sensitive period, where it develops the most before age 7, and that it can be really hard to learn language outside of the sensitive period, even though it can still happen. The same goes for biological structures when our bodies are developing. Certain structures and functions have a sensitive period in which they are most likely to happen. They can happen later, but it might be more difficult. Unfortunately, when errors do happen during pregnancy, there is a high likelihood of miscarriage. About 15% of pregnancies in the US end in miscarriage. However, larger studies looking at women specifically saw that at least 25% to possibly as high as 50% of women experience at least one miscarriage. Historically, miscarriage is something that doesn't get talked about, even though such a high number of individuals experience them. Teratogens, which are potentially harmful agents, are another type of hazard to prenatal development. This definition is pretty vague because there are so many different types which we will go into. But know that teratogens can affect some fetuses more than others due to things like individual differences in genetic susceptibility. Sleeper effects, where someone doesn't know they've been exposed to something and then the effects of it show up later on. Huntington's disease could be an example of this, where the onset doesn't happen until someone is in their 30s or 40s. And then there are cumulative impacts, which we might also call a dose-response relationship. This basically means that the severity of the effect will be determined by how much an infant is exposed to something and for how long. The more the exposure, the more at risk the fetus becomes for things like birth defects or major illnesses. One type of teratogen is drugs, and this could be anything from antidepressants to opioids like Vicodin or Percocet, marijuana, or nicotine. And nicotine is one that we have a lot of available data on. We know that smoking is associated with low birth weight in newborns, and when we look to see why this is, we see that nicotine actually constricts the blood vessels in the body, which it keeps nutrients from getting to the fetus, resulting in a lower weight at birth. Environmental pollutants are also a kind of teratogen. Things like toxic metals, synthetic hormones, plastic ingredients, pesticides, and herbicides can affect the fetus. This is a good time to remember the dose-response relationship we talked about. Both organic and non-organic produce has pesticides, and eating something like an apple isn't going to put someone at risk. You would have to eat hundreds of apples in one sitting to even get close to having a negative effect from pesticides. Instead, this has to do more with mass exposure. You wouldn't want a pregnant person out spraying pesticides on crops. There is also lead exposure, as well as air and water pollution. As you might guess from this, these are things that poorer people or those living in more crowded cities have to worry about more than others. Parental factors can also be considered a potential harm to the fetus. One factor here is age, which is interesting because we see an increase in problems both when the parent is young and when they are quote-unquote older, being in their 30s and 40s. When the parent is 15 or younger, we tend to see higher infant mortality rates, and when the parent is older, we see a decrease in fertility rates. We tend to say that fertility declines around the age of 35. The graph I have on the slide is from a study done with married women across different countries and shows the birth rate per 1,000 wives as a function of age. And you can see that between the age of 30 and 40, the fertility rate does decline, although it's not quite as dramatic as we might expect, given how seriously this is talked about in the media. Nutrition is also an important factor. We do see that general malnutrition of the birth parent does affect the growth of the fetal brain, which can result in later cognitive impairments like spina bifida or neural tube defects. The birth parent also has to worry about diseases. We do know that illnesses like rubella that are caused by a virus can impact the fetus. Sexually transmitted infections, STIs, like HIV or AIDS, can damage the central nervous system, meaning the brain and spinal cord. And things like the Zika virus, which is spread through mosquito bites, can lead to microcephaly, where the baby's head is smaller than expected. And then if there's not enough to worry about here, worrying too much can also lead to problems. We do see that the birth parent's emotional state is important during pregnancy. When there is increased stress, hormone levels can rise, which has been linked to behavioral problems in children. However, when people are highly stressed during pregnancy, they're likely to also be stressed after pregnancy, which makes teasing out the effects of pre- and postnatal stress difficult. And it's going to depend on the outcome you're interested in. Things like low birth weight and later antisocial behavior seem to be related to prenatal stress, while things like anxiety seem to be more postnatal. Moving into potential results from hazards. There are outcomes we have to worry about besides miscarriage and birth defects, like sudden infant death syndrome or SIDS. This is where an infant under 1 dies suddenly and unexpectedly with no obvious cause. When we look at the infants this happens to, we see an interaction between underlying biological issue risk and environmental stressors, along with an increase for infants with a rare genetic mutation that affects the breathing muscles. To minimize SIDS, experts suggest minimizing any opportunity for suffocation. This is done by placing an infant on their back to sleep, as opposed to their stomach, where their airway might be impacted by the mattress, using sleep clothing instead of wrapping them in a blanket, using a firm crib mattress and covering it with a tight-fitted sheet, and getting rid of pillows, bumpers, and stuffed animals. Basically, take away any extra material and make sure that any material that is around cannot get in front of their face. And this also goes along with not smoking near the baby. Another potential result from hazards is fetal alcohol syndrome, or FASD, which happens from alcohol consumption in pregnancy and leads to facial deformities such as an underdeveloped jaw or a low nasal bridge. It also leads to attention problems, hyperactivity, and other difficulties. And not all children will get every outcome of alcohol spectrum disorder. When a child has some, but not all of the symptoms, we say that they have fetal alcohol effects, which happens in about 1 in 1,000 infants born in the US. Looking at the birth process now, a full-term infant is born between 38 and 40 weeks gestation. By this point, the infant is typically face down and contractions start. These contractions help push the baby out, but also squeezes the child. This squeezing helps to reduce the overall size of the fetus's head through movement of plates in the skull that overlap. This is why infants have soft spots in their head when they're born, because these plates have not fused yet. The squeezing of the head also helps with hormone production, which then helps with mild oxygen deprivation while they are being born, and helps them with breathing afterwards. This also helps to force the amniotic fluid out of their lungs. Once the baby is born, we see that they start to interact with the environment right away. But this environment interaction is influenced by their state of arousal. The figure on the slide shows different behavior states of newborns within a 24-hour period. There are cultural differences with how much time babies spend in each state. But generally, we see that newborns spend most of their time asleep, whether that be a quiet light sleep or a deeper active sleep. The rest of their time is spent either alert awake, active awake, crying, or drowsing. Don't worry about knowing each state specifically, just know that newborns spend most of their time sleeping. Continuing on with sleep, we do see that newborns sleep about twice as much as adults, and that their sleep time declines throughout childhood and then through the rest of life. There are two main types of sleep. There is rapid eye movement, REM sleep, that was talked about briefly, and non-REM sleep. During REM sleep, we are in an active sleep state that is characterized by quick, jerky movements under closed eyelids. Again, REM sleep is associated with dreaming in adults, but it's hard to know if a newborn is dreaming. Non-REM sleep is a quiet or deep sleep state characterized by the absence of motor activity or eye movements, along with slower brain waves, breathing, and heart rate. Like we saw on the pie chart a few slides ago, infants spend about 2 hours a day crying. And because babies can't talk, crying is their signal of need. It gets the attention of the caregiver, and it can let them know when something is wrong, including illness, pain, or hunger. Crying does peak around 6 to 8 weeks and then decreases around 3 to 4 months of age. As you probably know, when a baby cries, we try to figure out what's wrong and soothe them. One soothing technique highlighted in the book is swaddling, where we snugly wrap babies up in a cloth or blanket to help them feel secure. And swaddling has been used for a long time in many different cultures. But as mentioned earlier, it's recommended not to swaddle while the baby is sleeping. Looking to see if how we respond to an infant crying has an effect on them, the results are inconclusive. One study showed that a quick response to a crying infant results in less crying several months later. However, a different study found that ignoring crying during the first 9 weeks reduced crying during the following 9 weeks. So there doesn't seem to be a consensus either way. Some infants do suffer from colic, where they have excessive, inconsolable crying for no apparent reason. Typically, we say infants have colic when they meet the rule of threes. They cry for more than 3 hours per day, for more than 3 days a week, and for longer than 3 weeks. About 1 in 10 infants in the US have colic, but luckily for both the infants and the caregiver, this typically ends around 3 months, and there are no long-term effects. Talking about outcomes at birth, we are going to look at infant mortality, where there is death during the first year of life. In the United States, we see that there are about 5.87 deaths per 1,000 births. However, we need to recognize that this is a national average, and that this number is higher for people of color, specifically Black, Native American, and Pacific Islander populations. Looking only at the age of mothers specifically, a study by Eli and Driscoll found that this number is higher for mothers under the age of 20. When we look at the most common cause of infant mortality, we do see that congenital malformation, deformations, and chromosomal abnormalities are the most common, along with short gestation and low birth weight, which may or may not tie into what we learned about teratogen exposure earlier in the lecture. So on the last slide, we talked about how the rate for infant mortality in the US is about 5.87 out of every 1,000 births. While the rate we would like to have is, of course, 0, this number might still feel relatively low. But when we look at our infant mortality rate compared to other Western countries, we see that we are much higher than the comparable country average. While there are probably many reasons for this, one major one is likely healthcare, as less individuals have access to it in the United States. When we look at birth weight in infants, we see that the average newborn is about 7.5 pounds. But we wouldn't consider a baby to be low birth weight until they are 5.5 pounds or less. And an infant 3.3 pounds or less would be considered very low birth weight. Low birth weight is concerning because we know that not only is it the second leading cause of infant mortality, but it is linked to a significant level of medical complications and neurosensory deficits, also frequent illnesses and lower IQ scores. And low birth weight might be because the infant was premature and born before 37 weeks gestation. Therefore, some structures may not have had time to fully form. There is an increase in infants being born prematurely if they're part of a multiple birth, like with twins or triplets. Or maybe they are small for age, where they are low birth weight but full term. This could be due to smoking, like we talked about before, where not enough nutrients are getting to the fetus. Or it could be due to something else entirely. It is difficult to determine outcomes for low birth weight babies because it is confounded with socioeconomic status, which is basically just how rich or poor you are. If you are rich, you are high socioeconomic status, and if you are poor, you are low socioeconomic status. Lower SES individuals are more likely to have low birth weight babies, who also have negative outcomes due to the lack of resources, which make it really hard to compare low birth weights and average birth weight infants. However, we do generally see that the effects of low birth weight do gradually diminish for most babies. However, special services and additional support might be needed. There are intervention factors that help to support low birth weight babies. One way is through kangaroo care, where the infant is held skin to skin with a parent. Breast milk also helps, along with what we call the triple C's: cuddling, caressing, and carrying the infant. And then educational programs for the parents also help as well to promote a healthy environment for the infant. When we look at models of risk for infants, where there is a low birth weight, birth defects, or more long-term problems like attention difficulties or low IQ, we tend to use a multiple risk model. This model looks at the effects of cumulative and multiple risks that affect normal functioning in a child. For example, if someone engages in substance use during pregnancy, it's likely that they are also under a lot of stress. They might not be eating well, they are less likely to seek prenatal care, and they're likely to not have a strong support system. Each one of these things can lead to negative outcomes alone, but since they are likely to occur together, they create this dose-response relationship we've been talking about, which you can see on this chart. And multiple risks are then associated with poverty. Poverty creates a stressful environment where resources are unavailable, which adds to the difficulties. And because poverty adds to this, we can think of poverty as a form of developmental hazard itself. It's also important to recognize the role of structural racism here. Structural racism describes the behavior and beliefs that harm specific racial and ethnic groups, which can result in residential segregation, uneven access to healthcare, higher rates of incarceration, low birth weight, poverty, and other tragedies. Your book states that African American infants born in areas with higher levels of structural racism are more likely to be small for gestational age compared to infants born in areas with lower levels of structural racism. And this finding is consistent with our understanding that stress impacts the fetus during pregnancy, especially since we see that pregnant women in minority communities who report higher levels of concern about racial discrimination are more likely to have preterm infants than those who report lower levels of concern. And then lastly, there is the concept of resilience, where infants that face developmental hazards still develop successfully. And the book talks about two main factors that promote resilience. There is one, certain personal characteristics, especially intelligence, responsiveness to others, and a sense of being capable of achieving goals. And then two, responsive care from someone. So maybe part of it is nature, but if nothing else, having a caregiver that is responsive can help fight this. And that is all I have for you this week. Don't forget to complete the quiz and assignment and let me know if you have any questions.